Welcome to our third lecture for anthropology. Still talking about culture. This is part Hamtao. That's the Egyptian word for three. Um, we're going to wrap up our look at culture and how we think about culture in this lecture. But the idea of culture is never going to go away since it's the core concept of the class, anthropology in general. So we'll keep coming back to the ideas that we've been looking at in these last three lectures. One of the things that it's helpful to keep in mind is that when you describe a culture, there's often a difference between what is the norm and what actually happens. Anthropologists call this the ideal cultural pattern. That is, the ideas and values and norms that are expected behaviors in a particular culture. So this is how people ought to behave. This is how things ought to happen. But the ideal and the actual may differ. And sometimes the people in that culture understand when the rules are broken and who gets to break those rules. Sometimes the rule breaking is like a, clutch the pearls kind of shock. A good example of that is the pharaoh and his wife depicted in the carving on your screen. That is Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. We'll talk more about them later in the course, but they instituted a series of religious and artistic changes that shocked many Egyptians. But of course, what can you do? It's the pharaoh, so you don't go against him. And the art that they created is very intriguing art. Um, the elongated heads, looking a bit alienish, um, large stomachs and thighs. Akhenaten has very much an interesting face shape that you see consistently in a lot of art from this time period. Sometimes you see them in very intimate settings doing really like family kinds of things, but in the art that you would see in public. Um, Lots of the art from this time period is very busy and very crowded. And so it's very clearly an actual change from the expected culture of ancient Egypt. So what is ideal has been thrown out for a while this guy is on the throne. And at the same time, though, I would like to point out that much of what you see in art from this time period still follows Egyptian rules. There's still an emphasis on showing all of the body parts. So you get that weird, funny, walk like an Egyptian kind of framing where you get to see all the arms and the legs. Um, they still are using hieroglyphs, and they're still using them for the visual as well as the verbal impact of them. They're still showing traditional scenes of things you would expect, scenes of thrones, scenes of worship. So even as the art from this period rejects the ideal culture and creates another culture, an actual culture, it still partakes of the original that it came from. So I think it's helpful for us to remember there's an ideal culture, there may be an actual culture, but they are often linked in ways that they can't escape each other. And sometimes they reflect each other in very sort of like specific ways that show that you can't escape the ideal, even as the actual is something different. So think about in terms of your own lives, is there like a cultural pattern, a rule or a norm or a value that in reality behaves kind of differently? So maybe the real culture operates in a different way. If you're privileged or powerful, think about it. Sometimes these actual cultures that reject the norm or partially reject the norm and yet are still part of it become their own subcultures. A subculture is a specific subset of the main culture. And so the people in the subculture come from the main culture, the ideal culture, but they may practice their own set of customs that make them unique and different from the main culture at large. And you can see I've got some pictures here of like folks from goth culture and punk culture, emo culture, Afrofuturist culture in the bottom right-hand corner there. These folks still do things that we would recognize as American. They still have on clothes. They still eat out at the restaurants we do. They still listen to music. They do all the things that you expect for cultural universals, but in their distinctive styles of dress and behavior, they've adapted and changed the main culture to reflect what they value and what they care about. So it's important for us to remember cultures do have lots of variations. You might think that there is one ideal culture, but maybe that ideal culture has a lot of variance within it. That means that people behave slightly differently from place to place, time to time. So these subcultures are in some ways both part of and in tension with the main culture or the ideal culture. And it's important for us to remember that cultures are not blocks of sameness. Even if you studied particularly maybe the goth culture on its own, you would even find inside of it there are differences, there are variations, there are ways that people approach that culture that may be slightly different from other folks. So one of the things I think it's helpful for us to remember is that humans are extremely variable. We are constantly variations on themes. We take main ideas and run with them and change them up and give them slight twists. We're our own, special recipe. So even though we might all partake in the main culture, we have these subcultures. And even within those subcultures, there are differences and variations that's important to remember. So our first slide introduced us the idea of an ideal versus an actual culture. What is the reality versus what do you actually see on the ground? Continuing along that theme, this slide introduces us to the idea that cultures have a lot of variation, and you may have subcultures within cultures. Cultures that are going against partially or maybe existing in tension with the ideal or the main culture. One of the reasons that culture has so much variance and so many unique ways for people to express who they are and to share different beliefs and ideas and traditions is the fact that culture diffuses. If you think about it as like a little drop of perfume in a room, eventually the whole room is going to smell like that perfume that you've put a little droplet of. The problem, of course, with that idea of diffusion is that culture doesn't diffuse like perfume or like molecules of chemicals across a membrane. It isn't an even process. And it's a process that changes depending on the circumstances that create the diffusion. So when a culture spreads its traits from one society to another, that might not necessarily be a smooth or even process of transmission. In the past, it often happened through trade. So you trade with somebody, you pick up a new idea from them. You're like, oh, that's cool. I like the way you solved that problem, or that's a really nice thing that you got there. I like that. And so trade introduces people to new ideas and new material cultures. Sometimes invasion, colonization, or imperialism leads to diffusion of cultures. Um, and you might see people sharing ideas in a situation where one group has more power than the other. So I don't want you to think that diffusion is exactly an even process, like a drop of perfume in a room. Um, but I do want you to realize that culture spreads. It moves from place to place as people come into contact. How it does so depends on the circumstances of that contact. Today, culture can transmit itself almost instantaneously, given the speed that we have of moving around the globe, both in person, thanks to our rapid transit, but also electronically through social media and electronic forms of communication. So that you can go to Europe and have McDonald's. I have actually had Burger King in Ireland, which is, I'm only slightly ashamed to say that, but I wanted to see if it was any different than American Burger King. It wasn't. It was exactly the same. You can go to Asia, in the case of the picture here, and have KFC. So today, culture can go rapidly around the globe and be shared, and we can be exposed to lots of different cultures. Maybe picking and choosing ones that we like or practices that we like and absorbing them into our own culture. So, how do people study all of this? Anthropologists rely primarily on what's called the ethnographic method, ethnography. This is just a method of gathering information through firsthand study of a culture. So you go and observe that culture. And there are lots of ways to observe. You can observe through written means, gathering data that way. You can observe through interviews. Um, you can read the materials produced by that culture. That's a form of observation as well. The goal, though, is to study firsthand, to document what you see, what you hear, what you taste, what you smell in these cultures as you are observing them. There are two ways to do that, and anthropologists do both because both have their place and both are important. One is to be from the emic point of view, which is to try to understand the culture from the point of view of a native. How does a person living in that culture see it? So if I'm trying to go to somewhere in Africa, I'd want to try to understand what people in that place are thinking and believing when they do what they do. So I would try to figure out how they're seeing their own world on their own terms. But you also kind of want to come to step back from that um, and look at the outside point of view, um, the edict point of view. This is the point of view that says we want to understand a culture comparatively and see it how it relates to other cultures, what's similar, what is different. So how is this culture viewed by others? Um, which is interesting as a sort of way of studying culture because it implies that you can look at a culture not just from within, but look at the cultures viewing other cultures. Like if there are two groups that are living near to each other, You could study both of those from the inside, but you can also study how they view each other. And then you can have your own outsider comparison, comparatively looking at all these cultures to see how they stack up, how they function, how they act, how they're organized. Both are important, both have their place. So it is very, very useful for you to think, well, they're not, one's not more important than the other. They both have a place in what we do when we're trying to study other groups of people. It used to be assumed in the 19th century that most people would approach all of this from a positivist point of view or an empirical point of view. The idea of that word is that we can generate an objective description. We just need to sit with our pen and we got to write down what we see. We're taking notes and we can objectively, factually document what we view there. The positivist approach, at its core, assumes that we can capture a reality. We can see a reality and we can capture it. And what we capture is a factual representation of what we're seeing. Most people now are lean more towards the postmodernist approach, which says there are more than one objective reality out. There's more than one objective reality out there. That objective reality that we're seeing is influenced by our own reality. So we can't separate who we are from what we're observing. So you run into lots of realities, your reality, my reality, and they sort of like come together in a messy collision of somewhere in the middle of all that, there's some facts. If I jump off a building, gravity is going to take over and I'm going to fall to the ground. I can't have a reality that says I will suddenly begin flying. It's just not going to happen. So somewhere in all of our viewing of the world, there is an objective reality, but it's clouded by us, our own observation, our own views, our own histories, our own beliefs and values mean we can only see very, very dimly through this objective world that we live in. So as we move forward, we're going to make some assumptions about the study of culture that we'll come back to again and again and look at and question whether or not these assumptions work. Keep in mind that because we're focused on ancient Egypt, the way we approach looking at culture is going to be slightly different. We can't go and ethnographically interview ancient Egyptians and say, hey, what did you think about the pharaoh? Did you like that outfit he wore last Thursday? Girl, please. We just can't do that. So we rely on archaeology. We rely on the evidence of texts that we have recovered from papyri and temples and tombs. We rely on the evidence that we gather from bones and trash pits. So all the stuff of archaeology is what helps us understand ancient Egypt. If you were doing a modern culture, it's a lot easier, of course, to go interview them. So keep in mind, as we question these assumptions, that how we interact with our material influences some of the results that we get. One of the assumptions that we're going to operate under is that culture adapts. And if it doesn't, it somehow dies. Culture has to be functionally adaptive because non-adaptive culture doesn't survive. This sounds very evolutionary, and if you were thinking evolutionary, yes, you're in the right mindset. We'll question whether or not this makes a lot of sense in ancient Egypt or the extent to which ancient Egyptians adapt, because they have a fairly consistent culture for several thousand years. Doesn't mean that it's perfectly consistent or always exactly consistent, but there's a lot of ancient Egyptian culture that remains the same. We will, however, note that when a culture comes in contact with an environment or other people, it may need to adapt. And here we can point to some examples from ancient Egypt that show that the Egyptians changed in response to others, as well as changes in their environment, though their environment is remarkably stable. That's something we have to think about as well in our modern world, because we're frequently coming in contact with others and our environment is pretty rapidly changing. So what does that mean for our future? What of our culture will adapt? What of our culture will die away? We're going to assume that culture is integrated. Okay, so what I mean by that is that the things that people do in a culture are linked together in a very purposeful, non-random way. People don't go through their day shifting from one aspect of their culture to another. They don't think, okay, I got to go be my religious culture now. I got to go now shift to being a scientific minded culture. And then I got to go shift to a business culture. And then I got to do a food culture. All of our culture is sort of messily intertwined to the extent that it makes some kind of sense to us. I'm not implying it's systematic, because humans are messy. We're not always consistent. We don't always behave the same in every situation, but we do have a tendency to try to put all of our culture together in a way that makes sense for us, so that throughout the day we remain integrated people functioning within the culture we live in. And one of the last things that we want to think about is that culture can be appropriated. Culture adapts, it changes, it comes into contact with others, but culture can also be bought and sold. It can be controlled. The question is, can it be owned? We're thinking about. It certainly is possible that you can take ideas and materials from others for a profit. You can take them not for a profit, but also to incorporate them in your own culture. And that has aroused some pretty serious debates in our own time about what it means to be part of a culture that originally wasn't yours. What power and privilege are you exercising to adopt this culture that you didn't grow up in or didn't belong to? And you don't really understand from the inside. You only understand as an outsider. An interesting sort of like take on that is at least as it relates to Egyptology, is the Kemetic religion. An Egyptologist, Tamara Siuda, in 1988 founded this religion, which is essentially a modern version of Egyptian religion. She claims to be the 196th pharaoh of Egypt, the Nisut. She's crowned in 1996 as this pharaoh. There is actually a temple in Illinois that you can go to. There are minor shrines all over the world. What do people in this sort of quasi-Egyptian religion, modern take on that, believe in? Oh, they believe in Ma'at, the order, the right order of the universe, the belief in a supreme god, Necher, veneration of the ancestors, or Aku, and respect for the community. This Kemetic religion does not follow ancient Egyptian religion exactly. So it is not a carbon copy of what the ancient Egyptians did. And in fact, it has things invented by Siuda and others that are part of its modern practices. So is this an appropriation? What is this? Is this a borrowing? Is this diffusion? What is going on in this modern creation of the ancient Egyptian faith? It's worth thinking about, and thinking about in your own life in ways that maybe you haven't thought about before. I'll leave you with an example in my own experience. I like to bake. Even though I can't have gluten anymore. Um, Baking is a lot of fun for me, and I like to bake challah bread, so a traditional Jewish bread for Shabbat. I like to put things in my challah bread. So at what point does adding an ingredient that is not traditional to the recipe make that something else? So culture constantly changes. It constantly adapts. It constantly is on the go and on the move. So it's worth us thinking about. What is our role in that? Are we appropriating? Are we just merely borrowing? Are we creating something new when we do these kinds of things? And we're going to come back to these questions again and again and again. You're going to see in tonight's homework, you get a chance to sound off on these issues. So I'm going to sign off for now, and I will catch you later.